I write on behalf of President Donald J. Trump in response to your numerous legally unsupported demands made of part of what you labeled, contrary to the Constitution of the United States and all bipartisan precedent, as an impeachment inquiry. As you know, you've designed and implemented your inquiry in a manner that violates fundamental fairness and constitutionally mandated due process. For example, you've denied the president the right to cross-examine witnesses. I doubt that's true. To call witnesses, to receive transcripts of testimony, to have access to evidence, to have counsel present, and many other basic rights guaranteed to all Americans. While during the investigation stage, that some of that might be true, but probably not all of it. But they definitely would have those rights in the Senate. So that's a little off point. You've conducted your proceedings in secrets. Again, to the extent it's an investigation, that would be more apropos. You violate civil liberties and the separation of powers by threatening executive branch officials, claiming that you will seek to punish those who exercise fundamental constitutional rights and prerogatives. All this violates the Constitution, the rule of law, and every past precedent. Never before in our history has the House of Representatives, under control of either political party, taken the American people down the dangerous path you seek to pursue. Put simply, you seek to overturn the results of the 2016 and deprive the American people of the president they've freely chosen. Many Democrats now apparently view impeachment not only as a means to undo the Democratic results of the last election, but also as a strategy to influence the next election, which is barely more than a year away, which I'm sure has crossed their minds, but as also should have crossed their minds, it has just as likely odds of being blowback and showing support to the president in the upcoming election. So, yeah. As one member of Congress explains, he's concerned if we don't impeach the president, he'll get reelected. Your highly partisan and unconstitutional efforts threaten grave and lasting damage to our democratic institutions, our system of free elections, and to the American people. For his part, President Trump took the unprecedented step of providing the public transparency by declassifying and releasing a recording of his call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. As far as I'm aware, that is pretty unprecedented. Diplomatic conversations are confidential and secret, so it was a bit of a surprise that that was published. The record clearly establishes the call was completely appropriate and there's no basis of the inquiry. That's open to interpretation, I suppose. The fact there's nothing wrong with the call was also powerfully confirmed by Chairman Schiff's decision to create a false version of the call and read to the American people at a congressional hearing without disclosing he was simply making it up. That was not a great moment for Chairman Schiff when that happened, where he basically created something and he didn't clearly label it as fiction. Not a strong moment. In addition, information has recently come to light the whistleblower had contact with Chairman Schiff's office before filing the complaint. His initial denial of such contact caused the Washington Post to conclude that Chairman Schiff clearly made the statement that was false. In any event, the American people understood Chairman Schiff cannot covertly assist with the submission of the complaint, mislead the public about the involvement, read a counterfeit version of the call, and then pretend to send judgment as a neutral investigator. Well, that's a pretty fair point. To the extent that that is true, it does show quite a lot of bias and animus, so it does show a lack of neutral consideration. But then again, impeachment is inherently a political process, so neutrality is kind of out the window to some degree inherently in the process. For these reasons, President Trump and his administration reject your baseless, unconstitutional efforts to overturn the democratic process. Your unprecedented actions have left the president with no choice. In order to fulfill his duty to the American people, the Constitution, and the executive branch, and all future occupants of the office of the presidency, President Trump and his administration cannot participate in your partisan and unconstitutional inquiry under these circumstances. Yeah, that's a lot of fight. Your inquiry is constitutionally invalid and a violation of due process. In the history of our nation, the House of Representatives has never attempted to launch an impeachment inquiry against the president without a majority of the House taking a political accountability for that decision by voting to authorize such a dramatic step. And that is fair as far as I understand on procedure goes. Every time there has been a official inquiry, the House of Representatives voted to create the inquiry. In this situation, the Speaker of the House just said, we're creating an inquiry. So that is a deviation from procedure as I understand it. Here, the House leadership claims to have initiated the greatest inter-branch conflict contemplated within our Constitution by means of nothing more than a press conference. Yeah, that's a fair point. Your contrived process is unprecedented in the history of the nation and lacks any authorization necessary for a valid impeachment proceeding. That's a fair point. The committee's inquiry also suffers from a separate fatal defect. Despite Speaker Pelosi's commitment to treat the president with fairness, the committees have not established any procedures affording the president even most basic protections demanded by due process under our Constitution and fundamental fairness. Chairman Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee has expressly acknowledged, at least when the president was a member of his own party, that the power of impeachment demands rigorous levels of due process, and in this context, the due process means the right to be informed of trial, the right of charges to be known against you, the right to confront witnesses, to call your own witnesses, and have assistance of counsel. All those have been abandoned here. So those are reasonable arguments in terms of what due process is. It's unclear if Chairman Nadler, despite being a member of the House, was talking about the House as part of the process or the Senate's part of the process, because those would be rights that would apply at the Senate. It was unclear if he meant that those should be rights at the House, but it's a fair point all the same. The due process rights are not a matter of discretion for the committee to dispense with at will. To the contrary, they're constitutional requirements. The Supreme Court has recognized that due process protections apply to congressional investigations. Okay, fair enough. Indeed, it is recognized due process clause applies to impeachment proceedings. And precedent for rights for cross-examination witness, call witnesses, and present evidence states for 150 years. Yet the committees have decided to deny the president these elementary rights and protections that form the basis of judicial system protected. No citizen, including the president, should be treated this unfairly. Okay. To comply with the Constitution's demands, appropriate procedure would include, at a minimum, the right to see all the evidence, to present evidence, to call witnesses, have counsel present, cross-examine witnesses, make objections relating to examination of witnesses, and respond to all evidence and testimony. Those do seem like trial-based objections, though, so that would be, again, what I think would be more in line with the Senate's part of the process. So that would seem to be things that would apply when the Senate gets this rather than at the House. But that's a fair point, all things being considered. Likewise, the committee must provide for disclosures of all evidence favorable to the president and all evidence bearing on the credibility of witnesses. The committee's procedures provide none of these constitutional rights. In addition, the House does not provide the committee rankings members with the authority to issue subpoenas. It's unclear what authority they have implicitly, but they should have some. The right of the minority to issue subpoenas subject to the same rules of majority has been standard bipartisan practice in all recent resolutions authorizing inquiries. Okay, that's a very, very fair point. To the extent the House has not said the minority can issue subpoenas, that would be a deviation of process. That's a fair point. The House's failure to provide co-equal subpoena power in this case ensures any inquiry will be nothing more than a one-side effort by House Democrats to gain information favorable to their views and selectively release it as only they determine. Okay. The House utters disregard for the established procedural safeguards files in past inquiries shows that current proceedings are nothing more than an unconstitutional exercise in political theater. Well, I don't know if it's unconstitutional or not. I think the House pretty much gets to do whatever it like. But as to political theater, I would agree. As if denying President basic procedural protections was not enough, the committees have also resorted to threats and intimidation. Threats by the committee against executive branch witnesses who have asserted common and longstanding rights destroy the integrity of the process. In letters to State Department employees, the committees have ominously threatened, without any legal basis, even issued a subpoena, that any failure to appear in a response to a mere request shall constitute evidence of obstruction. That is definitely not obstruction in any sort of legal sense. It's not obstruction if it's just a mere request. It would have to be a formal subpoena. Worse, the committees have broadly threatened that if State Department officials attempt to insist upon the right for the department to have an agency lawyer present at depositions to protect the executive branch interests, or apparently if they make any effort to protect those interests at all, those officials would have their salaries withheld. The suggestion that it would somehow be problematic for anyone to raise long-established executive branch confidentiality interests and privileges in response to a request for a deposition is legally unfounded. Not surprising, the Office of Legal Counsel, Department of Justice, has made clear on multiple occasions that employees of the executive branch who have been instructed not to appear or provide particular testimony based on privileges or immunities of the executive branch cannot be published for following those instructions. Current and former State Department officials are duty-bound to protect the confidential interests of the executive branch, and the Office of Legal Counsel has also recognized it's unconstitutional to exclude an agency counsel from participating in depositions. As you would think, if you're going to call members of the executive branch to testify, then you want someone there from the agency who can speak to the agency's interests. That's fair enough. In addition, any attempt to withhold an official salary for the assertion of such interests would be unprecedented, unconstitutional. I would think so. The committee's assertion on these points amounts to nothing more than strong-arm tactics designed to rush the proceedings without regard to due process and the rights of individuals. Threats aimed at intimidating individuals who assert these basic rights are attacks on civil liberties. Okay. The effort to impeach Trump without any regard to evidence of his actions in office is a naked political strategy that began the day he was inaugurated and even perhaps before. In fact, your transparent rush of judgment, lack of democratic accountability, authorization, and violation of basic rights in the current proceedings makes clear the illegitimate partisan purpose for this purported inquiry. Founders, however, did not create this extraordinary mechanism of impeachment so it could be used by a political party that feared for its prospects against the sitting president in the next election. The decision as to who will be elected in 2020 should rest with the people, exactly where the Constitution places it. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to deny that this impeachment inquiry is going to have political ramifications. For whom and to what benefit is unclear. And I think it's probably more likely than not it will ultimately benefit Trump in the end. About yeah, it's a little bit interesting to see how it impacts the political aspects of it. Democrats themselves used to recognize the dire implications of impeachment for the nation. For example, in the past, Chairman Nadler has explained the effect of impeachment is to overturn the popular will of the voters. We must not overturn an election and remove a president from office except to defend our system of government or our constitutional liberties against dire threat, and we must not do so without overwhelming consensus of the American people. There must never be a narrowly voted impeachment or impeachment supported by one political party and imposed by another. Such impeachment will provide divisiveness and bitterness in our politics for years to come and will call into question the very legitimacy of the political institutions. Unfortunately, the president's political opponents now seem eager to transform the impeachment inquiry from an extraordinary remedy that should rarely be contemplated into a conventional political weapon that will be deployed for partisan gain. These actions are a far cry from what our founders envisioned when they vested Congress with important trust of considering impeachment. Precisely because it nullifies the outcome of a democratic process, impeachment of the president is fraught with the risk of deepening divisions in the country and creating long rifts in the body politic. Unfortunately, you're now playing out the exact partisan rush that the founders warned against. The American people deserve better. Okay, fair points. It's transparent that you resort to such unprecedented and unconstitutional procedures because you know a fair process will exploit the lack of any basis in your inquiry. Your current effort is founded on a completely appropriate call between President Trump and President Zelensky, while the complete appropriateness of it is a political question and a legal question. So, to the extent that Congress thinks it's inappropriate, that seems to be something that's legitimate. Without waiting to see what was actually said, a press conference was called to hold an impeachment inquiry based on falsehoods and misrepresentations. To rebut those falsehoods and to provide transparency for the American people, President Trump secured agreement from the government of Ukraine and took extraordinary step of declassifying and publicly releasing the record of the call. The record clearly establishes the call was completely appropriate. The president did nothing wrong. There's no basis for the impeachment inquiry. At a joint press conference shortly after the public release, President Zelensky agreed the call was appropriate. In addition, the Department of Justice announced officials there had reviewed the call after referral for the alleged campaign violation and found no such violation. Okay. Perhaps the best evidence that there's no wrongdoing on this call is the fact that after the actual record of the call was released, Chairman Schiff chose to concoct a false version of the call and read his made-up transcript to the American people at a public hearing. Yeah, that was a massive misstep on the part of Chairman Schiff. This powerfully confirms there's no issue with the actual call. Otherwise, why would Chairman Schiff feel the need to make up his own version? The chairman's action only further undermines the public confidence in the fairness of the inquiry. The real problem, as we're now learning, is that Chairman Schiff's office and perhaps others, despite initial denials, were involved in advising the whistleblower before the complaint was filed. So to the extent that's true, to the extent that there is they were basically causing the whistleblower to file the complaint or otherwise, that might suggest some sort of improper actions there. Initially, when asked on national television about interactions with the whistleblower, Chairman Schiff quickly stated, "We've not spoken directly with the whistleblower. We would like to." However, it's now been reported the whistleblower approached the House Intelligence Committee with information and received guidance from the committee before filing the complaint with the Inspector General. As a result, the Washington Post concluded that Chairman Schiff clearly made a statement that was false. Anyone who's involved in the preparation or submission of the whistleblower complaint cannot possibly act as a fair and impartial judge, particularly after misleading the American people about the involvement. All these raise serious questions that must be investigated. However, the committees are preventing anyone, including the majority, from looking into these critically important relating issues. After all, the American people have the right to know about their own actions with respect to the matter. To the extent that there was improper influence from the legislative branch to cause this report to be made in the first place, it could suggest some sort of misconduct there too. So that seems to be a legitimate consideration. And Chairman Schiff's reading of a fake transcript was just a massive tactical error in my view in any event. Given your inquiry lacks any legitimate constitutional foundation, any pretense of fairness, or even the most basic elementary due process, the executive branch cannot be expected to participate. Because participating in the inquiry under current unconstitutional posture would inflict lasting harm and lasting damage, you have left the president no choice. Consistent with the duties and particular obligation to preserve the rights of future occupants, President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this inquiry under these circumstances. That's pretty bold language there. Your recent letter to the acting White House Chief of Staff argues that even if an impeachment inquiry were not underway, the Oversight Committee may seek this information as a matter of the established oversight process. Respectfully, the committee cannot have it both ways. The letter comes from chairmen of 3 different committees. It transmits subpoena pursuant to the House of Representatives impeachment inquiry. It recites the documents will be part of the House's impeachment inquiry, and asserts the documents will be shared among committees as well as among the Committee of the Judiciary as appropriate. This letter in no way is directed at collecting information in aid of legislation, and you simply cannot rely on oversight authority to gather information for unauthorized impeachment inquiry that conflicts with all historical precedent and rides roughshod over due process and separation of powers. Yeah, so to the extent the committee doesn't have proper jurisdiction over this because the House didn't give it jurisdiction, that's actually a somewhat valid legal argument. In the past, when the House gave them the authority, that would give them authority, but here that is absent. So that's a reasonable line of argument. If the committee wishes to return to the regular order of oversight requests, we stand ready to engage in the processes we have in the past, in manner consistent with the well-established bipartisan constitutional protections and the respect for separation of powers. For the foregoing reasons, the President cannot allow your constitutionally illegitimate proceedings to distract him and those in the executive branch from the work on behalf of the American people. The President has a country to lead. The American people elected him to do his job, and he will remain focused on fulfilling his promises to the American people. It is important work that must continue on his behalf, both at home and around the world, including continuing strong economic growth, extending historically low levels of unemployment, negotiating trade deals, fixing our broken immigration system, lowering prescription drug prices, and addressing mass shooting violence. We hope in light of the many deficiencies we've identified, you'll abandon the current invalid efforts and join the President in focusing on many important goals. Sincerely, Pat Cipollone, Counsel to the President. Okay. So that is the letter from the White House in which they are indicating that they're not going to participate with the congressional process so far. So there were a couple of valid legal points in here, and especially when it's referring to past precedent on how these things are handled. Now, ultimately, Congress is the judge of its own rules, and each House is the judge of its own rules. And the power to impeach says that the House is the sole judge of and sole person that can bring impeachment. So whatever process they find is going to be for a large part legitimate. But to the extent it doesn't conform with past practice, there are some issues there. And the fact that they don't allow the president or his allies to call people as part of the investigation process when that's been done in the past is a bit of a problem here. So there's definitely some legal good points in here. There's some legal errors on here on this viewpoint. I imagine the House is going to roughly ignore this. They're going to continue doing what the House is going to do, and they'll continue with their process. And I think there's roughly a 99% chance the House is going to impeach Trump because at this point they can't not, because they would lose too much political capital. So I think odds are that the House impeaches Trump by December the 31st, and that the Senate does some sort of hearing and trial in early January, February. So that's what I would expect, given where we are. And we'll see what happens next in terms of this process. But it looks like the White House and executive branch isn't going to cooperate. So that's all I have to say about that.